China is able to hyper-subsidize either through indirect or direct subsidies in these systems, tilting the playing field where we're going to have a much more challenging competitive environment for us to do these things here or to do them with circularity because they're not always necessarily prioritizing that themselves. And a lot of people in Washington see this, and all over the world, you know, we shouldn't be thanking China for subsidizing clean energy technologies for the rest of the world so that we can meet our climate goals faster. But that doesn't necessarily take into consideration the full cost of doing this. And so that's the cost side, I would say, of the trade-off. And then the other one is the timing. And as we sprint to meet our climate commitments, which are absolutely paramount, I have 2 degrees in sustainability, I care about this greatly. It's why I work in the mineral space, despite it feeling counterintuitive for some people. But as we sprint to meet those commitments, we need to maybe take a step back to make sure we're doing it with circularity in mind, which is more time-consuming to think about these systems from, you know, a different perspective, and then also, you know, with security in mind, and making sure that we are standing up, you know, standing up supply chains, reindustrializing the United States, our allies, in partnership with like-minded countries who have mineral resources, have the desire to go down the value chain themselves as well, and not necessarily just copying and pasting kind of the hyper-permeated approach that China has taken all over the world with Belt and Road and other very ambitious initiatives. So those are my 2 cents on the very overwhelming trade-offs in the space.
Thank you, Abagail. I'm so glad you brought up that story because I was going to prompt you if you didn't. But you know, it's great because you can get your head around it, you can understand this. They're glued together, so you can't do it. And in the story, the other thing I like about it is it has hope in the sense that, oh, once you know that, then you can solve it from a design or engineering perspective. And people in industries like mine think, oh, we can engineer an economy. Oh, but then we've got to think about affordability and cost, you know, and then that will in a second lead to policy. But just see, Heidi, if you want to add examples of trade-offs.
I will highlight what Abagail said. So in what I do with policy with producer responsibility legislation, which right now we're working on solar panels and e-batteries, so this is very relatable. The bottom line is when producers send products out into the universe and they don't care about end of life because they've done a good job, made a good product, sold it, it's good, they got their shareholders happy, but they've externalized onto the environment and local governments that are responsible for public health and safety and waste management, all costs with figuring everything out in the back end by themselves. And when I was advisor and the chair of the Waste Management Board in California, I realized this whole system is a complete mess. Local governments, one at a time, cannot figure this out. There is no way they will ever be able to raise taxes and garbage rates high enough to begin to account for what we have to deal with, that everything on the free market is somehow their responsibility to figure it all out. As it gets more complicated, as there's rare metals that we need back, all these other things. So I really started getting engaged and started pushing for extended producer responsibility policy because then the manufacturer cares about the cost of the glue. Right now, they don't have to care. So they'll revert back to what's cheapest. But what's cheapest is not what's best for the system, ecologically or economically, because what does that do? It makes us more vulnerable because we aren't able to keep these, we aren't able to recycle these materials efficiently and cost effectively. And we realized that with the actual computers because Sony was putting their batteries in with 3 different size screws. And when we were trying to pull the batteries out before we crushed the computer to recycle it, we had to have people literally with 3 different screwdrivers. And we said, can you please make it a pop out? And they did. And that saved so much, but they cared a lot more when it was boomeranging back and they had to start taking it back because 24 states passed legislation saying they had to take it back. So what we're trying to do is take in the C-suite, getting the focus not on just profits, but on people and planet by having them have to think life cycle by taking it back. And that's not a punishment. It is simply the reality that whoever designs the product has the authority, has the responsibility really, to design it so it can be durable, repairable, reusable, recyclable, because the rest of us back end, how on earth are we supposed to figure this all out? We don't even know what you made it out of, you know, so forth and so on. So that's why these are such good examples of like how this is all systems thinking in the big circle of Earth, and everything affects everything else. And there is a bill in Congress right now by Cassidy that we're supporting because it's about pollution being imported from other countries because they've externalized again all the costs, and we're not embedding those costs in the products, and they're undermining our more responsibly made products in the United States. That's not okay, and we have to change that. So there's legislation to address this.
Thank you for that. Do you mind if I ask you to follow up? By the way, before I do that, and then we're going to get into policy, we'll invite Greg and Abagail into that. But I want to be sure we have time for your questions and your comments. So get those ready. I'm going to ask one more round here. I'm going to ask some follow-up first with Heidi. But get ready because I want to bring you into the conversation shortly, thinking about what you'd like to say or ask in the panel. What I want to follow up on, Heidi, because it was burning in my mind from an earlier panel discussion about producer responsibility. And I think it may be a definitional issue, but you'll know better because I'm not an expert in this. But the point was made by one panelist that when you think of producer responsibility, it may not always be the actual producer that is in the best position in the economy or in their expertise to do the recycling, and therefore we should make sure we don't create a system where they cannot contract with or whatever. And I think about this coming from an industry that used to be everything was conglomerates and every company was doing everything. That's not efficient. Now there are times when they can come together. So, but sometimes that might be a separate value chain, a recycling value chain. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that issue. Okay, good.
Yeah. So the way EPR works, and now there's like literally over 1,000 of these programs around the world for a wide variety of products. It started with cars and packaging, cars being the most toxic product according to Europeans and so forth. Now it's pretty much almost everything. But the bottom line is, the EPR systems are set up by the producers so that they'll form a nonprofit, 501c3 in the United States, so it's for public benefit. You don't let them do C4 or association benefit or anything else, because then they do funny things. So we set them up as C4.
I'm in Washington, I know about this.
Yes. The type of nonprofit matters a lot. And then they work together to set up an efficient system for that product category, whether it's electronics, or it's mattresses, or carpet, or even medicines and needles, which we've passed in California. And they set up the entire collection system, they design it, but that nonprofit is managed by people who are experts in the whole system of EPR and take back. And we've often pinged our friends in Canada, like Product Care or Return It, to help us set up our US systems in EPR. Because expertise is in the collection, not in the manufacturing and distribution, but there is overlap in reverse logistics and other things and how we get these materials back. So on that, the nonprofit's in charge, the producers pay in, they decide who runs it, and they decide on the ultimate design, but they don't necessarily have to do all the things, they contract.
Thank you for that clarification, and it gets us into naturally the how of policy, but the other thing I'll observe about that was, this is in this together in action, and EarthX in action, is you have somebody saying, hey, yeah, producer responsibility, yes they are, and I'm seeing companies stepping up, and you're saying, yes, but let's add policy to it, and there might be disagreements over the details. I'm not saying any of those aren't meaningful, but there's an amazing amount of sort of consensus around this, which you can see, which is nice.
And
so, yeah.
I have one quick thing,
Yeah.
is the reason that we pass laws to do this is because the companies ask for it. It levels the playing field.
Ah, yes.
Because if I externalize, this is a true story from Germany, the Braun shaver, they imposed EPR, the Braun shaver lasted 12 years and the Chinese knockoff lasted 2. Guess which one was cheaper? The Chinese knockoff, so everybody was buying that. But as soon as EPR came into play, guess what happened? That Chinese knockoff got a lot more expensive because of the boomeranging back every 2 years. And all of a sudden that durability that Braun had built in, they benefited from financially. If you don't have a fair and level playing field across the product category, it's not fair. The business will have to raise their prices when others don't. And those costs are still paid for by the public and the economy.
So one observation, one more question, we're going to go to the audience, but I can't resist saying as we move into policy, I got to know Greg when he was running an organization that was advocating for a carbon price. When I was in BP, people were like, why would you want them to add price to your commodity? Well, we could not do what we needed to do and knew we needed. And there's great demand by customers, society, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions without addressing what is an externality. So that's, and this whole concept of externality I was also seeing coming out. So over to you, Greg, in terms of, and then you, Abagail, just a policy or a couple of policies that you think, and briefly why, would be most impactful in exploiting the synergies here and then dealing with the trade-offs.
So there is one policy that if we adopted it globally would do more to address global emissions than any other policy, probably every other policy combined, and that would be a global price on carbon. So a price on carbon fuels when they enter the economy, which would create a level playing field. It would create synergies between industries. It would create incentives for innovators, investors to invest in lower carbon solutions. However, as we know, the likelihood of a global price on carbon being established in one action is very low. I think we could probably go as far as to say it's not going to happen in one action. But we can still get there, or we can get close. It's just going to require taking it step by step. So big chunk of emissions by big chunk of emissions. As Bob has already teased, I am a proponent of a U.S. carbon price, which would be the most efficient way to decarbonize the U.S. economy. The U.S. accounts for 12% of global emissions. However, politics around the U.S. carbon price at this moment are not good. And the likelihood of a U.S. carbon fee being established in the near term are relatively low. But there are other parts of the global economy where large portions of emissions can be accounted for. And an area that we're really interested in right now is international borders. So about 25%, a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with goods that ultimately cross an international border. So just as the US economy, when fossil fuels enter, that's a big chunk of global emissions. So too are international borders. And if we were to establish a fee at international borders, we would create that incentive. We would levelize the playing field for manufacturers wanting to access those markets. We would levelize the playing field. We would create incentives for those manufacturers to lower their emissions. We would create competition for everybody to lower their emissions further, to gain cost advantages in those markets. We would lower global emissions. So one policy would be what I'll call a carbon import fee. It's been referred to as a carbon tariff or a border carbon adjustment or carbon border adjustment mechanism. But the idea is the same. You're assessing a fee on an imported good based on the carbon emissions it took to make that good. But the real powerful lever would be countries coming together in common cause to develop a trade arrangement in which at least part of that arrangement is to establish a common border carbon adjustment on all goods coming into those countries. So, for example, if the G7 countries came together and formed this kind of club, which, by the way, they are already discussing, and the imports to those countries match the carbon performance of the domestic industries in those countries, we would lower global emissions by 2 billion tons per year. So huge, huge, huge emission reduction opportunities. There are other trade tools that we can leverage beyond just border carbon adjustments. And so hopefully that is a good tee up for Abagail to answer the question.
Can I do one quick follow-up? Because I'll be sure I'm following the logic, which is it feels like the latter part of what you're saying, because a lot of people are very concerned, oh my God, tariff, smooth poly tariff put us into depression. We don't want protectionism. But it sounds like what you're describing is the border carbon adjustment, a country might do that initially, but that becomes the spur for the development of a coalition of countries that do that, allies that do that, or carbon clubs and that kind of thing. So it doesn't end up just being each company imposing their own barrier and then all the negative trade effects. Is that?
Exactly, and as opposed to a traditional tariff, which if you are an exporter to a country who has a tariff for that product, you cannot avoid it. That is what you will pay at the border.
Yeah.
A carbon tariff, a border carbon adjustment, is avoidable if you lower your emissions. So it's much more like a performance standard, an environmental performance standard, than it is an economic tariff. But yes, also what you said.
That's really helpful, thank you. That makes sense, because people get that confused and they get worried. Abagail, what would you say?
So SAFE's long advocated for radical transparency across these supply chains, and so my kind of read into some of the trade policy tools, particularly with the lens on recycling, is like we don't necessarily know what materials we have in the United States, which makes it much harder for us to have that secondary life in a domestic context or reuse in a domestic context. And so this is something I actually learned from, Adina's old organization. I say that because I see she's about to ask a question about, the actual harmonized tariff schedules, like all bulking together all of these different types of materials, and then not necessarily being able to create as much transparency in like what's going to third countries or to China, and then we buy back later as something else. And so the ability to kind of shine a light on what we're actually exporting so that we can be a little bit more strategic and incentivizing keeping it here is one policy I would recommend. Another thing, especially as right now, and this goes back to the timing tension, right now critical mineral prices are really, really low. Lithium prices are like 84% lower than they were about a year and a half ago. And so that really undermines the economics of using recycled content instead of virgin material that's very, very cheap and available to us. And so we need to be able to have more of a demand signal in actually having a percentage of recycled content included, like the EU Critical Raw Materials Act does. Right now we don't have anything to that end, and so there's no real kind of, carrot to draw us. And I'm eyes wide open, and as should everybody, that you do need some of this raw material, these virgin materials, to help kind of meet the thresholds, like for density, durability, flame, like retardation, like all this stuff. So it's not all going to be kind of perfect, but you should kind of think about ways that you can incentivize at least trying to do that so that we can make it economic for these recycling facilities to stand up in the now, because right now they're not really able to do so without that signal. And then I had another one that was really, really thoughtful, but maybe it'll come back to me after I speak.
Did you want to add anything?
I will just say that recycled content legislation is like one of my favorite things, because as soon as we get closed loop systems in demand, like for example, I'm working on carpet bill right now in California to improve our carpet stewardship program, which by the way, carpet now is all plastic except for very rare Berber. We need that recycled content back. Where are they pulling from now? Bottles. They're taking Coke bottles, putting it in carpet, calling it earth friendly, but the truth is that carpet is harder to recycle, and it's downcycling. It's not upcycling or keeping it a circular loop. And it was food grade, downgraded to now something we can't use as food grade. So we want them to keep their bottles to get recycled content over there, and we want carpet to go into carpet. Otherwise, it just goes in the landfill. And I'd love to work with you on that. Legislation in the United States would be really fun.
I remembered my other idea. I mean, circling back to the full value mining approach, and that would be just, there already are great pieces of policy at work, like the Defense Production Act, that helps with kind of retrofitting processing facilities so that they can have kind of the secondary smelting of different materials, or retrofitting mine sites to be able to have more of those byproduct materials extracted. And so I think we need more of that to help with the economics, and then help kind of extend the lifetime of some of these mines by focusing on these byproduct materials so that we're not digging new pits. And so I would just emphasize the need for that, those types of things, as well as remediation. The Good SAM Act has been circulating in Congress for a really long time. It's just a pilot program. We need to be able to pass these kind of smarter policies that actually help us enable circularity and remediation of these facilities and sites.
Thank you. We won't get into permitting reform, but it's pretty hard to dig new pits. So
That's why we consider our old pits.
Right, exactly. So I want to invite questions from the audience. Is that Adina? No. Adina, hello. If you don't mind, since you were in the last panel, describe your role, and would love to hear your comment or question.
Yeah, sure. So, Adina, I'm the Executive Director of Global Steel Climate Council. I actually wanted to tease out the one of the early questions on trade-offs a little bit, because we didn't get a chance to do this at the end of our panel on thinking systemically about circular economy. That there, as much as I have drunk the Kool-Aid on circular economy, there's still really important trade-offs that have to be considered on a systemic, both at the local, the national, and of course at the international level. I'm all in on carbon border adjustment for sure, because I think it can be a level playing field, but we have to be mindful that there are going to be companies, entities in the world that are just going to say, well, forget that, I'm just going to go take my business elsewhere, and then it becomes a carbon leakage problem. So how can we make sure that carbon border adjustment mechanisms, whatever they look like around the world, or bringing a club together, can design it in a way that doesn't prevent, the dirtiest stuff just going somewhere else. Eco design, which includes recycled content, can sometimes be racist if we don't think about how we design it so that it doesn't prevent, producers of products from certain communities from being able to access the market as well, whether it's through price premium, whether it's through the requirement of certain content being included that may not be inherently available to producers. And this is actually starting to take place, actually not really in the US, but Europe is heavily involved in eco-design. That's probably going to lock out a lot of African production of various goods and materials because they're just not going to be able to meet, those requirements. So that's not going to be very helpful. And then thinking about material, the reduction of material use, maybe material substitution, and what is that going to do for economies and communities that are heavily dependent on extraction for their GDP and for their own livelihoods. And again, I'm all for, trying to minimize and reduce extraction, but we need to think about what that just transition is, from that perspective. And then just as a last comment on extended producer responsibility, because in the US we do have EPR in the electronics space, but it did put companies out of business and put electronics recyclers out of business. Because what happens is the nonprofit does contract with one company or a certain collective of companies, and it locks out others from being able to compete in that market. And that's just sort of coming full circle of what I do now, where steel grew up and is a great circular story in the United States without regulation, without even government support, without subsidies and things like that. So, I'm just trying to, I don't know that I have a question unless, please react, but I just wanted to make sure that we just tease out that there are definitely big, wide trade-offs in the system that it comes with circular economy. And it's hard, it's definitely hard, but just to keep, that all in mind.
Thank you, Anita, thank you. That was great. So, Greg and then Heidi, is that okay? Yeah, and then Abagail.
Sure. On the water carbon adjustment question, I'll be very brief. How do you avoid leakage? So 3 things to consider. So first, policy design, to do as much as you can to track and prevent gaming the system, and that's a whole different conversation for policy design. Second, strengthen numbers. So the more of the global economy you have participating, the harder it is to find other markets to dump your higher carbon products. And then related, 3, we need carrots for the developing world to join these clubs. If the proposition is simply be part of our carbon intensity fee club, the developing world with the high carbon intensity is not going to join it. But if there are carrots in the form of market access or financing or whatever, that to me seems like a way to bring more of the world into a club, strengthen numbers, preventing dumping.
And then we'll play off what Greg said on policy design. I came to the EPR point made, is that on the electronics, that was one of the earliest EPR programs that was getting adopted by states, and they were all very different because we tried to do a national negotiation, and several of the large electronics manufacturers walked away. And I always say that's you're either at the table or on the menu. And they were ended up on the menu because then all the states went and did different things because they're all different sausage making machines. And so then you end up with different legislation, and then everybody's screaming, we need to harmonize. I'm like, yeah, we told you that 12 years ago. But, so the problem is that the policies were different, and some were major mistakes were made, and you pointed one of them out. And so we're fixing those in the new bills, but devil lives in the details of policy every time. And I encourage everybody, do not just believe what somebody you think you agree with says to you. Read the actual words on the page. I can't tell you how many times I've been told, oh, it's this, and I'm reading it going, no, it's not.
Totally Congress did that when they passed.
I know.
Abigail, do you mind? I want to go to another. Did you want to get in on this?
Just quickly on the substitutability that Adina mentioned, and I think this is something that people think about a lot with we're moving away from cobalt because everybody's fearful that the cobalt used in batteries in their iPhones are coming from the DRC with forced labor, and like it's far more complicated than that, and it's not transparent, so it's really hard for us. But I think we need to couple all of these different policy mechanisms with capacity building, and so that we can, and tech transfer, so that we can help support these economies also develop these extractive, processing, refining industries alongside it, because at the end of the day, they don't even have access to the electricity that we are so fortunate to enjoy. And so there's a minimal intensity to that. There's ways that we can kind of design it for those markets, and it's going to take a ton of work, but it's really an important point.
Thanks for bringing up access and energy policy. It's really important. Yes.
Hi, my name is Janet McGilligan, and my question and my observation is much more boots on the ground. I am a hostage negotiator and counterterrorism expert. I've helped end 5 wars, and I ran the first exchange agreement between China and the US, and I've done negotiations to end the impending war in the Nile at the request of the Egyptian Prime Minister that would have encompassed 10 countries. I have a proposal together before the Sudanese government as this war ends. But one of the things that I know is going to be difficult is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does not allow us a level playing field in any way, shape, or form. There was a secret codicil agreement that the Russians put together to put a nuclear base in the Red Sea that would have allowed them 4 nuclear vessels. They did it because they don't have to apply and pay attention to our rules and regulations. You've got the Chinese who go in. I wrote the white papers for the Arab League on how to negotiate with the Chinese back in the 90s. You've got the Chinese that go in and they take the minister of petroleum, they take the minister of mining, and they promise them the world. And they pay them off. The things that would put us in the ground. So until and unless, and I'd love to hear your feelings on things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, until we begin to have an attention span in this country that is longer than that of a gnat, we will accomplish almost nothing. And when you look at something like the war in Sudan right now, there are 27 million children who have not been in school for a year. That's a lost generation. There are 50 million people on the verge of starvation. And what do you see in our news about it? Almost nothing. As this country comes back into play, you have the Egyptians, you have the Saudis, you have the UAE, you have all these regional players that understand the importance strategically. And when I say the importance strategically, for 6 years, I was the negotiator between the FBI and Arab intelligence on the bin Laden case. You don't understand how fundamentalism creeps in. You might, Mr. VP. But ISIS, Al-Shabaab, what's going on in the African Union, we in this country do not pay attention to the developing world. And if you think they are going to give a damn about carbon credits as anything other than to get your money and do what you want, because they have to get these kids back to school. They have real practical things to deal with, and they feel punished. They don't feel like they're a part of something. They feel like they are the target. So how do we deal with the realities instead of just the policies?
Thank you for that. And I don't know, I mean, that's a big question. I don't know that we can answer that, but Bill, we have one more person. I want to make sure we get to.
Quickly, is in California, we just passed a bill that says we cannot export plastics to countries that cannot manage it properly. There's things that are happening. That was a very enormous comment, but yeah.
Thank you, Heidi. Let's just at least take one more, Bill, and I know we're running short on time, but you have a question or a comment, and then we'll